Welcome. We're pleased to have Pablo Rapetti from ITAM Mexico with us here today, and he's going to be talking about Dworkin's theory. And his paper is titled Anti-Archimedeanism, a Postural Critique. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all of the conveners for the invitation to be here. I'm really happy, really grateful. Thank you all for coming as well. So I must start by apologizing. In the first place, because I sent this text, which of course is not even the scheme of a paper, really is just a set of arguments in quite a rough version. I guess the advantage of it is that it's quite short, so I hope you could read it. And in the second place, I have to apologize because this is actually the first time I give a talk in English, so I'm afraid I won't be as fluent as I would like to be. I gave one a couple of years ago, but I read then, and I won't be reading now. So maybe it will be not my best version. But anyway, since the text is quite short, I hope we have the time to both get into the arguments as presented there, and as well saying something about, say, the surroundings of these arguments I present. So about this, I would like to say in the first place that I think Dworkin's Anti-Archimedeanism is pretty much the grounds of all of his work. It's his meta-philosophical position, in a way, the core of his methodology, I would say. And I think there are several consequences that Dworkin extracts from this, or that follow from this position of his in this meta-philosophical level. And one of these consequences, which I think is of great importance, has to do with the fact that assuming this anti-Archimedean position actually leads him to reject the famous Hartian distinction between internal and external legal points of view and legal statements, which I think is a resource of great importance for general jurisprudence. And of course, this anti-Archimedeanism is as well the reason why that leads him to advocate for a normative kind of jurisprudence instead of the, say, conceptual jurisprudence that Hart was trying to develop. And there are many important consequences that also follow from this. I think, for example, his now very famous challenge to legal positivism, based on how to explain legal disagreements, is precisely based on this. And that on the other side, for legal positivism, important consequences follow if we can rescue the Hartian distinction between internal and external statements. So I will try to say something more about that by the end of my talk. In the second place, I would like to enhance a bit of what I say when I introduce Dworkin's Anti-Archimedeanism in my text. So I follow Kevin Toh here, saying that you can break down his anti-Archimedean position in basically two main assumptions, right? On the first place, the idea that he Dworkin seems to endorse a very strong thesis about the autonomy of ethics, of first-order moral discourse, right? This implies that ethics, morality, first-order moral discourse, is autonomous in the sense that nothing which is non-moral can contribute in any way to the justification of moral positions, moral claims, moral standards. And the other assumption, the second assumption, has to do with what Dworkin seems to take as the general aims of metaethics in general. Why do I mention ethics and metaethics? I would like to say something else about this as well. I think he's anti-Archimedeanism is a very general position that embraces the relation between ethics and metaethics, but that is more general than that, that has to do with the way in which you can philosophically theorize about any kind of social practice which in any way involves reasoning with norms. And that's precisely the reason why he can easily take his discussion and rejection of metaethics in the traditional way that it seems to be understood to what conceptual jurisprudence in the, for example, Hartian way is generally understood. So I focus on what he says about metaethics and in the way in which I would say he rejects metaethics, but I would like to emphasize this. I would like to emphasize the fact that the anti-Archimedean position is more general than his challenge against metaethics in particular, right? So these are the two main assumptions in his discussion in particular of metaethics, right? The autonomy thesis in this very strong sense that I mentioned, and the second assumption is the idea that the general aim of metaethics is to wholesale either vindicate or debunk certain first-order moral positions, moral claims, moral standards. Why do I say that the autonomy thesis, the first of these two, is in a strong version in Dworkin's work? Well, this is something that I have not emphasized the necessary, probably, in the text, and has to do with his argument about the translatability of the metaethical second-order discourse into first-order morally committed discourse. That's precisely the trick. So the way in which he goes for, I would say, the strong version of the autonomy thesis has to do with the sum of his idea about how metaethics has to do with either vindicating or debunking wholesale first-order moral positions, plus his argument about the translatability of one level of discourse into the other, right? So in the text I present three sets of arguments to discuss his general position as sketched by these two main assumptions. In the first place, I take hold of Simon Blackburn's work in metaethics. I quote at length one of the things that Blackburn says about the relationship between his metaethical projectivism, his metaethical theory, and first order discourse, right? So he claims that even though there is a kind of natural relation of getting along of his metaethical projectivism with certain forms of first order stances, in particular consequentialist first order stances, he claims specifically, expressly, that this is not a necessary connection in any way. And I try to illustrate this in my paper, besides the quote by Blackburn himself. I try to illustrate this with a very sketchy account of promises. I try to show that one might be at the same time a projectivist in Blackburn's sense and try to give a deontological explanation of how promises work, right? One might be certain that when someone claims that breaching a promise is wrong, is morally wrong, she is just projecting her view about the matter. But this projecting the view about the matter does not exclude even self-consciousness on the part of she who is claiming that breaching a promise is wrong, right? She might even herself be very conscious about that. She might even subscribe a kind of projectivism, such as Blackburn's, and with no contradiction, still feeling that the way in which to explain and deal with promises has to do with the respect for others, the need not to mediatize others, to use them as means, and so on and so forth, right? So the idea is, one might be a projectivist in general about meta-ethics, and this does not necessarily turn you into a consequentialist when it comes to first-order moral discourse, right? And this is compatible with not being a consequentialist, with being, for example, a deontologist, right? That's the general argument, which is, of course, very sketchy, but just to show the kind of plane that I quote from Blackburn. And so then I moved to the autonomy thesis, the first of the two assumptions that I mentioned in Dworkin's work and in Dworkin's anti-Archimedean position. And I tried to show that the strong version of the autonomy thesis seems lacking in the explanation of, for example, certain kinds of disagreements. So I presented in the text an example of a disagreement between two parties, and actually a legal disagreement in particular, and I would actually say it's a fundamental legal disagreement because it has to do with the ultimate validity criteria of a particular system, and I try to show how there is an interconnection between meta-ethical claims or second-order claims and first-order claims. In this case, it would be, if you like, jurisprudential claims as second-order claims, and then the normative first-order claims that are proper of participants of the legal practice, arguing about what we ought to do in legal terms, right? So in the example, I talk about John and Julie. John claims that we ought to decide a certain case with norms which are validated by the ultimate criteria of validity of the system. And I say, well, let's say that he assumes that these A, B, and C are the validity criteria of the system, and he advances a normative claim according to which we ought to decide by the case, by any norm which is validated by these kinds of ultimate validity criteria, right? And let's assume that Julie shows convincingly to him that actually the validity criteria that he takes to be the proper criteria working on the system are not those he thinks they are. So let's say that he thinks that A, B, C, these validity criteria are those that the majority of the people think they are. And he claims that whatever he sees that the majority of the people of the community take to be the validity criteria are, in fact, the validity criteria applicable, right? So let's assume that Julie shows to him that those are not the majoritarian validity criteria. So if John started the disagreement by claiming that the case should be decided by application of the norm n, because he takes n to be validated by one of these validity criteria that he thought were the majoritarian, and Julie convinces him that those are not the actual validity criteria of the community, then if he wants to be consistent with his normative claim that we are to decide a case according to a norm validated by any of those, then he will just change his mind. He will have to say that the norm n is not the norm to decide, to adjudicate the case, because it's a norm which is validated by a criterion which is not one of the actual validity criteria of the system, right? So in this kind of example, what Julie does is appealing to a non-normative claim, which in very rough general terms we can say it's a second order claim about what are in fact the validity criteria of the community. So when she shows to John that the validity criteria are not those he assumed that were operating in the community, then that seems to be all the normative, not normative, I'm sorry, all the background that she needs to make John change his mind. And even though John's claim is normative in his position about how to decide the case is normative, it's based on certain assumptions of fact in this case, right? And if she is able to change his mind about the facts, then at least if he wants to stay consistent with his own normative criterion how to decide the case, he will change his mind as well, just because the facts are different from what he thought they were, right? So this is a kind of interrelation that I wanted to insist on the paper, because of course it does not imply that second-order claims are normative claims, but it does show that there is a link between the way in which second-order claims can sort of make an influence on first-order normative claims proper, right? And if we take the autonomy thesis on a very strong version, this kind of link, which is important in the end, seems to be neglected, right? That is the upshot of this kind of argument. In the second place, I try to show that from a second-order external stance, you can anyway show to someone that he or she is being normatively incoherent, right? So in a sort of detached way, one might point out to another that, well, if you hold this normative criterion as you claim, and this other normative criterion as you claim, maybe in this case C, these two might be conflicting with one another, and that would be already an important influence on the normative reasoning of the other person involved, right? And this will not take you outside a second-order non-normative level of discourse. That's the idea. So these kind of interrelations seem to be neglected if one takes the autonomy thesis too strongly. This is general point. So in the second place, I try to, in a more general level, try to evaluate the character of Dworkin's anti-Archimedean arguments and his anti-Archimedean position in general, right? So the basic thing here, I think, has to do with the fact that his claims are either metaethical or not, or if you want it the other way around, they are either normative or in particular moral or not. And so the question is, what is the character of the anti-Archimedean position, the anti-Archimedean argument? So the interesting thing to note here is that these claims seem unable to be metaethical, because if they were, they would be self-refuting, right? The anti-Archimedean position implies the rejection of metaethics, the rejection of this distinction between two levels of discourse. So if one takes the anti-Archimedean arguments to be metaethical, then they would be self-refuting, because they imply the rejection of metaethics. So on the other hand, we have the possibility of taking these claims as normative, and in particular as moral, right? But this already would seem to be quite odd, I would say. So if we take his anti-Archimedean position to be moral, then the rejection of metaethics is a moral rejection of metaethics, a sort of moral criticism of the practice of metaethics. So if you are a metaethicist, you are somehow doing something which is morally wrong. Which is this somehow? Well, it has to do with the fact that for Dworkin, metaethical positions have to do with the debunking or vindicating of moral positions, right? So they seem to have, or they have, according to him, first-order moral consequences. And these moral consequences, we presume, are morally reprehensible somehow, right? So if we take the anti-Archimedean position as moral, then we have to think of the rejection of metaethics as a moral rejection of metaethics. And this seems already quite counterintuitive, I would say. Here comes the hastiest part of my quite hasty in general text, because here I claim something which I know is quite underdeveloped, but the general idea is that maybe even more important and stranger, certainly, consequences would follow from taking the anti-Archimedean arguments as moral. What I try to say there is basically the following. Generally, metaethics is intended to be, of course, an Archimedean enterprise, an Archimedean practice. And it is generally taken to be a part of practical philosophy, in the basic sense that it deals with norms, with practical concepts in particular, right? It is a part of practical philosophy in the sense that it deals with practical concepts. And with this, I'm pointing to the general divide that sometimes is made between practical philosophy on the one hand and theoretical philosophy on the other hand, right? So metaethics is generally considered to be practical philosophy in the minimum sense that it deals with practical concepts. So if Dworkin's rejection of metaethics is taken as a moral reproach of the practicing of metaethics, then one might wonder whether this rejection does not extend to any other kind of practical philosophical discipline, right? Because the other practical philosophical disciplines which deal with other practical concepts as well would be precisely in the same kind of situation of metaethics, that is, dealing with the understanding of practical concepts. So if the proper understanding of practical concepts should necessarily involve normative reasoning in the way that Dworkin would like to, and if this necessarily implies the impossibility of staying external and aseptic and neutral about them, then probably this has to do with any other kind of philosophical, practical, in this sense, discipline, right? But at the same time, metaethics is normally taken to be theoretical on the other hand, but just not now because it deals with practical concepts, which is what it does, but because it deals with theoretical questions. In particular, metaethics is generally to be, at least in part, a metaphysical kind of discipline. It asks a metaphysical question, the metaphysical question of whether there are any normative or moral, in particular, facts, right? So it's concerned with what there is in the world in some sense. So if this implies the normative version of the anti-Archimedean arguments imply the rejection, the moral rejection of metaethics in this sense, then it also implies the moral rejection of theoretical philosophy, at least as concerned with these kind of metaphysical questions. So one might then wonder which would be the dividing line between practical philosophy in general and theoretical philosophy in general. This would be the argument. So this kind of distinction, which is fairly standard in the philosophical literature, would erase as well by the application of these kinds of Dworkinian arguments, right? This is the idea. And of course, I repeat, taking those kind of arguments as a normative reproach of practicing it, right? So if there is no clear dividing line between these two kind of philosophical disciplines or sets of disciplines, then this might run the huge risk of actually becoming a full rejection of philosophy, right? Which is fairly strange in itself. And so the third kind of argument that I present deals in particular with the translatability argument that Dworkin advances. So how does this run? Here I follow a great article by Paul Bloomfield discussing Dworkin's anti-Archimedeanism in particular as well. And so Bloomfield says, look, according to Dworkin's position, something like the following seems to hold. He says, take a statement like, there is no right answer to the question of whether slavery is immoral. From Dworkin's rejection of Archimedeanism, from this kind of statement, one might seem to think that it follows another statement such as, it is false to say that slavery is immoral. And this in turn would seem to imply, according to this very line of reasoning, that then slavery is not moral, or is not wrong. And this is the way in which Dworkin precisely tries to show how metaethical, apparently second-order discourse has actually first-order implications, or is translatable, as I say, into first-order discourse, right? So, I repeat, there is no right answer to the question of whether slavery is immoral. And from this seems to follow, it is false to say that slavery is immoral, and then in turn, then slavery is not immoral, which seems fairly clearly a first-order claim, right? A normatively loaded claim. So Bloomfield proposes to pay attention to the negation of the first claim, right? So there are many ways in which we can negate this first claim, but let's take just one. So instead of there is no right answer to the question of whether slavery is immoral, let's think of there is a right answer to the question of whether slavery is immoral, right? So it seems pretty clear that from this claim, there is a right answer to the question of whether slavery is immoral. We can derive the two kind of answers to this kind of thing, right? We might say that there is a right answer to the question of whether it is immoral, which is that it is, in fact, if you will, immoral, but we also can follow this claim by the claim that slavery is not immoral. So both answers are available and plausibly will follow from this kind of claim, right? I can say that there is a right answer to the question of whether it is immoral, and that answer could be positive or negative, right? So Bloomfield says there is already a kind of neutrality involved in this very statement. There is a right answer to the question of whether slavery is immoral, is neutral enough in a way because it can be plausibly followed by both kinds of answers, both the negative and the positive. And this is neutral enough. Let's say that this is neutral in a weak sense, or in a first sense, if you will. I try to expand these that Bloomfield says by just pointing out this very simple thing. You can, at the same time, very plausibly follow this kind of statement with the statement, however, I don't know what it is, right? There is a right answer to the question of whether slavery is immoral, but I don't know what, right? If you want to make it even more interesting, a metaethicist, for example, might want to say there is a right answer to the question of whether slavery is immoral, but it is not mine to say, right? It's not my job to tell you what is that right answer. And this shows, I hope, that these kinds of claims are neutral in an even stronger sense, right? And showing that there is that kind of neutrality involved in statements such as this shows that metaethical second-order statements are not necessarily translatable into first-order discourse, committed discourse. And at the same time, it shows, therefore, that there is room for the practice of metaethics, there is room for second-order discourse about ethics, about morality, but not of ethics or in ethics, right? This would be the idea. In the text, I present what could be counter-arguments from a Dworkinian position and try to sketch replies to those counter-arguments as well. I think I may leave those aside for now, and if you want to, of course, we can discuss about them in the Q&A section. But I would like to finish this part of the presentation with what I would say is the main upshot of this discussion, in particular concerning the jurisprudential agenda, right? So I would say that the Dworkinian anti-Archimedeanism is precisely the general grounds of his work, and therefore it is in particular the grounds of his objection to legal positivism in terms of its alleged inability to account for legal disagreements. Since you cannot adopt theoretical external stance, then you are supposed not to be able to account for legal disagreements among participants of legal practice. And I would say that if you reject anti-Archimedeanism in this strong version that Dworkin advances, then you can get back the resources to actually face the challenge, right? As I said at the beginning, anti-Archimedeanism implies the rejection of internal and external statements. So if you reject this version of anti-Archimedeanism, then you can take that distinction back. And that distinction can in turn be used to account for legal disagreements in a way which is, I think, plausible enough, right? So what a legal positivist can say about legal disagreements is, and curiously enough, this is what Dworkin himself would say, disagreements among participants are normative disagreements, are disagreements from what to do with the law as applied to a certain case. And I would definitely agree with that. And I think Hart would agree with that. He would say that, of course, the legal disagreements of the type that Dworkin is interested in are disagreements which are normative in character because they involve opposing internal, that is, normative legal statements, right? The only thing is that, as the positivist claims this, he's doing it from an external point of view. He's using external statements, just stating how participants may argue among themselves and how these arguments would have a normative character because the statements involved would be normative. Of course, a consequence of this, and this is something that Dworkin now would not be in favor of, is that the theorist, the jurisprudent, qua jurisprudent, as a jurisprudent, cannot say anything to actually adjudicate among the disagreeing parties. That is, cannot resolve the disagreement because the disagreement is normative in nature, and the theoretical activity of the jurisprudent is non-normative in nature, at least as conceived by traditional conceptual jurisprudence, right? So when you bring back the distinction between internal and external legal statements, you bring back the kind of stance that a conceptual jurisprudence would like to preserve for himself or herself, right? And this implies that you can account for disagreements among participants within the law, but of course you cannot adjudicate these kinds of disagreements, right? One final comment, and with this I finish. My text is entitled Anti-Archimedeanism, a partial critique, and I don't really say anything in the text of how is it that the critique is just partial, right? And I would like to say something about this. I say that it is just partial because the Dworkinian anti-Archimedeanism is based, as he himself claims in Justice for Hedgehogs, in Hume's law. and I would like to preserve Hume's law. Of course, there's a huge debate about it, and many actually think with really strong and competing arguments that there is no dividing gap in the way that Hume thought it was between normative discourse and non-normative discourse. But I would like to hold on to that divide. I would like to keep on thinking that Hume is right. And in that sense, I think the autonomy thesis holds. It just doesn't hold in the strong version that Dworkin claims it does. Of course, we need normative premises to get to normative conclusions. I would like to stick to that as well. But that does not mean that there is no logical space for the practice of metaethics, the practice of a second-order discourse, and in consequence to the jurisprudential agenda, that there is no room, no space for a kind of conceptual jurisprudence in the sense that Hart, for example, was trying to go for. And this would be, thank you very much.
There's a lot to think about and discuss later, but before we go to the Q&A, we have George Nikalau of University of Oxford, and he's prepared some comments and remarks. George.
Okay, thank you very much. Conversely to Pablo, I'll be speaking from my handouts, and precisely because it's not my first talk in English. So thank you, Pablo. I think this was a very interesting and a very thought-provoking paper. It was a very interesting rebuttal of Dworkin's anti-Archimedean stance. And I think it was very clear and very lucid, which is should be not taken for granted when it comes to metaethics. Now let me start by saying that I suspect there are two reasons why the conveners were kind enough to ask me to comment on Pablo's paper, both pertaining to my nationality. The first is that it goes by presumption, if not by definition, that I'm on the Dworkinian camp as a Greek. The second is that, and I'm afraid I have to disappoint them, that they probably hoped I could make something out of this obscure polysyllabic term that Dworkin calls Archimedeanism. I hope I won't. So now I have two main comments and two further questions with respect to Pablo's paper. The first comment is a bit more extensive than the rest, but I'll try to keep everything a bit short. So, my first point, I take it that you are making the claim that in order for Dworkin to be able to reject metaethics in the way he does, he must necessarily accede to some sort of metaethical skepticism. At least that's the one version of it. In other words, he must do so from an Archimedean, another meta-level perspective. But he cannot do so, your claim goes, without contradicting himself in the same way that the moral skeptic contradicts himself for Dworkin. Now I think a Dworkinian might want to push back against this idea. I take it that Dworkin wants to shift the burden of proof, maybe better, the burden of argumentative soundness, to the metaethicist. He would say that moral skeptics must claim truth for their own metaethical propositions because they are claiming there is something more than first-order morality. Whereas Dworkin, on the other hand, does not make such a claim. He does not claim that there is something more than first-order morality. So the idea, I think, that Dworkin needs an Archimedean perspective in order to reject metaethics would somehow, I believe, beg the question in favor of metaethical theories. It implies that in every field there is always a meta level, whereas Dworkin argues that this does not need to be the case. Particularly, I think it is not the case in the field of morality, for which Dworkin has argued that every metaethical theory is, as you said, translatable into a first-order moral stance. To make the claim that in order to reject metaethics you need some further layer, let's say of metaphysics, of metaethics, should thus not be taken for granted. I think a passage from Dworkin here might be a bit useful, and let me quote it, which is characteristic of his line of thought. It's from Just for Hedgehogs, pages 41 to 42. So Dworkin says, as I said in chapter 1, moral philosophers have characteristically insisted on a fundamental distinction between moral judgments and philosophical judgments about moral judgments. Russ Landau claims that the distinction is evident in other fields. He says that we are not doing mathematics when we ask about the ontology of numbers. We can stand apart from theological disputes and still query the basic assumptions of religious doctrine. But many philosophers, Dworkin continues, of mathematics do think we are doing mathematics when we declare that numbers exist. And we certainly do not stand apart from religious dispute when we insist that there is no God. On the contrary, we stand at the center of that dispute. The distinction that philosophers like Landau have in mind is at best semantic. And then Dworkin, after a few sentences, goes on. Landau adds, we can leave our grammar books aside and still ask about whether grammatical facility is innate. Yes, Dworkin says, because the latter question, whether grammatical facility is innate, is biological, not grammatical. No view of biology disagrees with any opinion about correct grammar, but there is nothing else for moral skepticism to be but moral. End of quote. So for Dworkin, every kind of moral skepticism necessarily culminates in some form of first-order moral reasoning. For him, even the status moral skeptic, who states that first-order moral positions are altogether incomprehensible, will end up saying that there are no categorical reasons for action. Therefore, the moral skeptic would subsequently have provided an answer to the question of what one should do, and this answer would be for her to do anything at any moral issue given. With regard to the example you gave about the normative loudness and how you translate the there is no right answer to slavery, there's no right to whether slavery is immoral premise, I'm thinking of another formulation that Dworkinian might espouse. That would be, there are no categorical reasons against slavery. So I think that formulation could again be translated into some sort of first order moral reasoning. Now I come to my second comment. You say in your paper that it looks that for Dworkin, one would not be able to stay Archimedean about morality, but could be Archimedean about other social phenomena. Now I'm with you on that, and I believe this is a correct understanding. However, I'm a bit skeptical about a further inference you draw from this, and that is that every kind of debate could ultimately be recast as a moral disagreement. Perhaps you continue. We should even conclude as well that there cannot be morally irrelevant matters. Now, I think it might be the case that every debate about what one has to do can be articulated in terms of reasons for action, but it does not go without saying that these reasons need necessarily be moral in all cases. There might be all sorts of reasons, I mean prudential, aesthetic, ethical, and so forth. I'm not sure it's all about morality in Dworkin's reading. I now come to my questions. The first question is rather a clarificatory one. You say, in quoting Kevin Toh, that for Dworkin there is some sort of ambition and intention underpinning metaethical theories. The claim is that the use of a particular metaethical theory is for Dworkin only a way of vindicating or debunking wholesale first-order moral stances. Now, I'm not sure about that, but it really may be so because my knowledge is rather limited on the field. So surely I think that Dworkin thinks that every metaethical stance is translatable into a certain first-order moral stance, but I am not sure whether he accuses metaethicists of deliberately using their theories to advance corresponding first-order moral positions. Now it might not make much of a difference, but I would be grateful for a comment on that. With regard to my second question, I think you've already answered it a bit, and it has to do with how do you think that Dworkin's rejection of metaethics has to do with his account of law, and especially the account he gives in Just for Hedgehogs later, which is the pure interpretivism account, as it has been called, instead of the hybrid interpretivism. Some theorists have termed his account in Laws and Power. So how crucial do you think the rejection of metaethics is for his conception of law as exclusively a branch of political morality, and because I think that one could draw parallels between the way Dworkin rejects a metaethical take on first order morality and the way he takes morality as the viewpoint for understanding law. I'd really be very interested in hearing your thoughts on that.
Thank you. Thank you. Just let me write down one more thing.
I think I might have been a bit quick.
So should I answer right away, or maybe if
Just
anyone
give the
else?
responses that you think are appropriate now, and then later on we can go to
Great.
the main.
Great. Well, thank you very much. These are great comments. So let me go one by one. So in the first place, you mentioned the idea of who's got the burden of proof, right?
Or I think because proof has to do with metaphysics and Dworkin wouldn't like this idea.
Yeah,
Maybe the proof of argumentative soundness, something like that.
Yeah. All right. So I think when you presented these observations, you already went to what I think the core of the answer will be situated, if you will. Because you went on to the question of the translatability, right? And I would say, and this I think I wrote precisely on the text as well. I would say there is room for meta-ethics if you are not able to show from a Dworkinian perspective that every apparently metaethical statement ought to be interpreted as a first order statement, or can only be read as a first order statement. So when I present my argument against this idea of translatability, I think what I try to do is to show that metaethics gets a room for itself, and in general, second order discourses get a room for themselves, as long as you can interpret some statements as neutral. So I'm not saying that there are lots of good reasons not to translate certain claims which could be taken as metaethical or second order into first order claims. What I'm just saying is that as long as you can interpret some of them as neutral, then there is already space, logical space, for the practice of metaethics. So I would try to reply then that Dworkin fails to the burden of proof he's got on his own, because he would need to show that there is a reason for which to always translate claims apparently from a second order into claims of the first order. But I don't see there is a reason for doing that. And in particular, I don't see there's a reason for doing that because as I try to show with my examples, that would leave potentially huge amounts of discourse aside or unexplained. So if I say there is a right answer for the question of whether slavery is immoral or moral, and then I say, but I don't know what it is, or I don't want to be the one saying what it is, or something like that, then this kind of second statement by me would somehow be inappropriate. And I don't see why are we bound to think that it's inappropriate. So this is basically what I would reply. The burden of proof in the challenge against metaethics and second level discourse has to do with showing that there is a reason for you to always translate claims. And I don't think there is such a reason available now. So in the second place, you basically pose the question of whether, for a Dworkinian perspective, is it all about morality somehow? And maybe this passage of my text that you refer to is another one of those who are particularly hasty, and I would definitely grant you that. But what I would answer is, how would you Dworkinianly try to draw the line between what is, for example, a prudential claim and what is a moral claim, right? So, on a first look, one might think that whatever the way in which you actually draw the line, that way implies stepping outside the potential claims in play to show that, see, this one is moral in character, but this other one is prudential in character. Now, I know Dworkin might want to say, well, the question of whether a certain claim is moral or prudential is a moral question in itself. But that would be strange. So if I say that a certain claim X is a prudential claim, I would be morally affirming that the claim is prudential. One might say, well, this implies that I'm claiming that X is morally irrelevant or something like that, and since it's morally irrelevant, then you can take it as prudential or whatever, right? So this whatever already poses the question. So imagine that it is the claim X in particular is neither prudential nor moral nor, I don't know, egotist or whatever. So what is it that you use to say that the claim is, for example, either prudential or egotist in a negative way, right? How is it that it has to do necessarily with a moral assessment of the claim itself? I would say that that's not very intuitive, because if morality is irrelevant in relation to the claim X, because the claim X is not moral, then how can morality actually adjudicate whether the claim is prudential or something else which is not prudential but not moral either? That, I would say, would be strange. And this is another way of illustrating this consequence that I think maybe actually follows from the Dworkinian position, that everything boils down to morality. Because if you actually try to respond to my question saying that it is morality itself that allows you to claim that X is not a moral statement, then it seems that morality itself as well has to tell you exactly what that kind of claim that is, what's the character of the claim X. And that actually seems very counterintuitive, I would say. And then you mentioned another way of presenting my statements on the translatability argument, which is the question of whether there are any categorical reasons, right? I think that applies very much to the extension of Bloomfield's argument that I tried to present in my text. You know, that debate about abortion, which is a kind of reprise of Dworkin's debate on abortion in Justice for Hedgehogs, right? In which three parties are presenting what seem fairly straightforward moral claims, and a fourth party is saying something about abortion. There is no right answer to a question of abortion or something like that, because abortion is neither permissible nor prohibited nor impermissible, right? And this fourth party as well claims that his claim is not moral in character, but physical or metaphysical, whatever it is that would make for the prohibition, mandatoriness or permissibility of abortion, it does not exist, right? And I try to face that by changing the example, and basically the way in which I changed the example has to do with the fact that the parties involved in the conversation that I advance as an example think for themselves that they are actually debating in metaethical terms and not in ethically committed terms, right? And my question basically is, why is there a necessary reason for us to think that all the other three parties of the disagreement are actually mistaken about the kind of conversation they are having, right? I would say that this is there is no reason for us to bound us to think that they are actually mistaken, that they could not be having a metaethical conversation if they actually intend to have a metaethical conversation. I think they are having a metaethical conversation. But another way of putting this point, which would not be mine, this is a very nicely presented argument by Josep Luis Martí and Hugo Seleme in a paper that I quote in my text, is that it has to do with the fact that Dworkin seems to have a misunderstanding of what moral permissions are. So one might say there are at least two kinds of permissions, which we may call permissions in a weak sense and in a strong sense. So something is permissible in a weak sense just in case there is no norm claiming that this thing is prohibited, or for that matter that it's mandatory in any way, right? But on a strong sense, there is a permission when there is actually a norm saying that something is permitted, right? So in this kind of disagreement that I present, it is not the same to claim that there is a moral norm saying that abortion is permitted than there is saying that there are no moral norms saying anything about the status of abortion, right? And this is what maybe some metaethical stances would imply, right? But this does not say anything precisely about the moral status of abortion, because it has nothing to do with moral norms, right? With the content of moral norms, and that would be my take. And in the third place, you mentioned the connection between my discussion of Archimedeanism as to metaethics to the way in which that is projected into the legal agenda, in a way, jurisprudential agenda. I hope I said enough before, so I don't steal that much time from the rest of you. But of course, if you guys want, we can keep on going precisely on that subject. Thank you.
Would you like to jump in now? Or?
Maybe later in the discussion.
Maybe later.
Yeah.